Hey, Holy Girls, welcome back to Holy Girl Talk. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back and spending this time with me again. I really don't take that lightly. And if this is your very first time listening, welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Holy Girl Talk is a modern faith podcast where we talk about God, scripture, womanhood, healing, transitions, and real life in a way that feels honest, grounding, and human. You don't need to have everything figured out to be here. You don't need to be strong all the time. This space is for women who are growing, rebuilding, and figuring things out as they go. If Holy Girl Talk has been meaningful to you, make sure you're following the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And if today's conversation reminds you of someone who's entering a new chapter or starting over, feel free to share it with them. These conversations are meant to be carried together. Today's episode is about starting over. Not in a dramatic overnight kind of way, but in the slow, intentional, sometimes uncomfortable way that real life actually happens. We're talking about Noah, and while his story is often told as a children's story about animals and rainbows, it's actually a deeply adult story about obedience, isolation, rebuilding, and trusting God when everything familiar is being stripped away. This episode is for the woman who feels like she's rebuilding from something. Maybe you're leaving an old season behind. Maybe you're redefining your purpose. Maybe you're healing from disappointment, burnout, or loss. Or maybe life just doesn't look the way you thought it would by now, and you're trying to figure out what faith looks like from here. Noah's story reminds us that starting over with God doesn't mean you failed. It often means God is doing something new, and new beginnings rarely feel comfortable at first. They require trust, endurance, and a willingness to follow God even when the outcome isn't clear. So, if you're standing at the beginning of a new chapter, or even in the middle of rebuilding something you never thought you'd have to rebuild, this story is for you. Let's get into it. Noah's story matters so much when we're talking about starting over, because it shows us what it looks like to rebuild when the world around you feels unstable. Noah wasn't starting fresh because life was exciting or full of opportunity. He was starting over because everything around him was falling apart. The culture was chaotic, the environment was corrupt, and the future felt uncertain. And that's something many of us recognize. Sometimes starting over doesn't come after a clean ending. It comes after disappointment, after burnout, after realizing that the way things were cannot continue the way they've been. Starting over often begins when staying the same becomes more painful than change. Noah's story reminds us that God often calls people to rebuild in seasons of disruption. Not when everything is calm, but when everything is unsettled. And that can feel overwhelming because rebuilding requires vision, patience, and a willingness to move forward without guarantees. For anyone listening who feels like they're piecing things together right now, emotionally, spiritually, or practically, this story speaks directly to you. Noah didn't rebuild because it was easy. He rebuilt because God called him to, and that call gave meaning to the work, even when the work itself was heavy. To really understand Noah's obedience, we have to understand the world he was living in. Noah wasn't surrounded by encouragement. He wasn't living in a culture that supported faith, integrity, or righteousness. Scripture describes his environment as chaotic, corrupt, and deeply broken. People were doing whatever they wanted, however they wanted, with no regard for God or for one another. And that context matters because obedience is always harder when you're going against the flow. Noah was called to live differently in a world that had normalized dysfunction. He was called to stay grounded in his values while everything around him was unraveling. And that kind of faith requires courage. This feels very familiar today. We live in a world that often rewards shortcuts, celebrates noise over depth, and pushes instant gratification over long term faithfulness. Choosing patience, integrity, and obedience can feel isolating. It can feel like you're doing too much or missing out. But Noah's story reminds us that living differently is sometimes the very thing that preserves us. Noah wasn't perfect, but he was faithful. He chose to walk with God even when it set him apart. And that decision to stay aligned when alignment wasn't popular is what positioned him to be part of something new. Starting over with God often begins with choosing to live differently, even when it costs you comfort or approval. At some point in the middle of all that chaos, God speaks to Noah, and what he asks Noah to do is not small, it's not simple, it's not convenient. God tells Noah to build an ark, a massive structure, something that would take years, consistency, and commitment. And what's important to notice is that God gives Noah instructions before there is any visible sign that they're necessary. This part of the story speaks to anyone who has felt called to build something without immediate confirmation, to start over without clarity, to move forward without knowing exactly how things will turn out. Whether it's a new direction, a healing journey, a lifestyle change, or a step of faith that doesn't make sense to anyone else, Noah's story reminds us that faith is not about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who's giving the instructions. Noah didn't argue, he didn't negotiate, he didn't wait for the environment to change. He accepted the assignment as it was given, and that kind of obedience isn't dramatic or loud, it's quiet, it's consistent, and it requires the kind of trust that grows over time. One of the hardest parts of Noah's assignment is that he had to start building before there was any evidence that rain was coming. He didn't get confirmation first. He didn't get reassurance through results. He had to commit to the process without knowing when or if anyone else would understand what he was doing. That's what makes this part of the story so real. Faith often requires action long before clarity arrives. Noah showed up day after day, doing the work, following the instructions, and trusting that obedience mattered even when progress felt invisible. There were no applause moments, no public validation, just consistency. And this mirrors what starting over looks like in real life. Sometimes rebuilding means doing the right things quietly, going to therapy even when healing feels slow, showing up consistently even when motivation is low, making changes that don't immediately pay off, trusting that what you're building will matter even if no one sees it yet. Noah's obedience reminds us that just because something is unseen doesn't mean it's insignificant. God often works through long processes, not instant results. And when we commit to building what He asked us to build, even without proof, we are trusting that He sees the full picture, even when we don't. Obedience sounds inspiring until you're living in it day after day. Because obedience isn't just a moment, it's a process. Noah didn't build the ark in a weekend. This was long, repetitive work, the kind of work that tests your commitment when excitement wears off and all that's left is discipline. There were likely days where Noah felt tired, days where the progress felt painfully slow, days where the question of, is this really worth it, crept in, and that's where endurance comes in. Endurance is what keeps you going, when the initial faith feels quiet and the finish line feels far away. This part of the story matters because starting over often requires more patience than we expect. Rebuilding isn't glamorous, it's showing up when results aren't obvious. It's continuing to invest energy into something that hasn't yet paid you back. And that can feel discouraging. Noah's story reminds us that obedience isn't about speed, it's about faithfulness. It's about continuing to do what God asks you to do, even when the work feels heavy and unseen. And every step of obedience, every day you show up matters more than you realize, even if you can't see the outcome yet. Another weight Noah likely carried was isolation. Obedience doesn't always come with community support. When you're doing something that doesn't make sense to the people around you, it can feel lonely. Noah was building something no one else believed in. He was committing to a vision no one else could see. And that kind of obedience can separate you from familiar voices. There was likely ridicule, questions, doubt, people wondering why he was wasting his time. And that's often what obedience looks like before results show up. You're misunderstood, you're questioned, and sometimes you're left to carry the assignment quietly without validation. This part of the story speaks to anyone who has felt alone in their growth, anyone who has made choices others didn't understand. Setting boundaries, choosing healing, walking away from old patterns, or committing to a new path. When obedience isolates you, it can be tempting to give up just to feel connected again. But Noah's story reminds us that not everyone is meant to understand the assignment God gave you, and that doesn't mean the assignment is wrong. Sometimes isolation is part of the process, not to punish you, but to protect what God is building in you. Eventually, the flood comes. And while we often talk about the flood as judgment, it's also important to understand it as a transition. The flood marked the end of a world that could not continue the way it was. It closed a chapter that had become too broken, too harmful, and too far from what God intended. And endings like that are never light. They carry grief, loss, and finality. This part of the story matters because starting over often requires something to end. Sometimes God removes what cannot come with us into the next season, not because he is harsh, but because what once existed is no longer sustainable. The flood wasn't just destruction, it was protection. God sheltered Noah and his family inside the ark while everything around them was being reset. And that's deeply relatable. There are seasons when God protects us by removing us. When doors close, environments shift, and things we once relied on fall away. It can feel confusing, even painful, but sometimes God is keeping us safe while he clears the ground for what's next. The ark wasn't punishment, it was provision. It was a place of covering during a season of transition. And that's important to remember when life feels like it's being stripped down. God often shelters what he plans to preserve. What often gets overlooked in Noah's story is the waiting that happened after the flood began. Noah didn't step off the ark immediately. He waited. He waited while the waters rose, and he waited while the waters slowly receded. He was no longer in the old world, but he also wasn't yet in the new one. He was suspended in between. And that in between season is one of the hardest places to live. You know what you've left behind, you know you can't go back. But what's ahead hasn't fully taken shape yet. You're protected, but you're still waiting, safe but uncertain, obedient but without clear direction for what's next. This part of the story speaks to anyone who feels like they're in limbo, not who they used to be, but not yet who they're becoming. Waiting for clarity, waiting for confirmation, waiting for life to feel settled again. And it can be tempting in those moments to rush ahead, to force movement just so you don't feel stuck. But Noah waited for God's timing, not his own comfort. He trusted that stepping out too early could be just as dangerous as staying too long, and that kind of patience requires deep trust. Trust that God will open the door when it's time, trust that waiting is not wasted, trust that just because nothing looks different yet doesn't mean nothing is happening. The ark wasn't just a place of survival, it was a place of transition. And sometimes the most important growth happens in seasons where nothing feels clear yet. Eventually, the waiting ends. The waters recede, and Noah steps out of the ark into a world that is completely new. Familiar landmarks are gone, old systems no longer exist. Nothing looks the way it used to, and yet this moment isn't marked by fear, it's marked by purpose. Noah didn't step into the new world empty handed, he stepped into it shaped by obedience. The years of building, the endurance, the isolation, and the waiting had prepared him for what came next. He wasn't starting from scratch. He was starting from experience, from faithfulness, from trust built over time. This is such an important truth for anyone beginning again. When you step into a new chapter, you are not behind. You are not unprepared. Everything you walked through, every hard season, every quiet act of obedience, every moment where you kept going when it was difficult has shaped you for what's next. Fresh starts can feel intimidating because they're unfamiliar, but Noah's story reminds us that God doesn't bring us into new seasons without equipping us first. What looks like a reset is often the result of long preparation, and what feels like a beginning is often built on deep foundations you didn't even realize were forming. After Noah steps into this new world, God places a rainbow in the sky, and it's easy to see the rainbow as a simple symbol of hope. But it's so much more than that. The rainbow is God's covenant. It's a promise, a reminder that what Noah endured mattered, and that God had been present in every part of the process, even the parts that felt long, quiet, or confusing. The rainbow shows us that God doesn't just bring us through storms, he marks the moment afterward. He gives reassurance that what happened wasn't meaningless, and that what's ahead is being watched over. For Noah, the rainbow wasn't just about protection from future floods, it was confirmation that obedience is seen, remembered, and honored by God. This part of the story is especially comforting for anyone who has been through a difficult season and is still waiting for reassurance. Sometimes we come out of a storm and wonder, was it worth it? Did any of that matter? The rainbow answers that question. It tells us that God doesn't forget what we've walked through. He doesn't overlook the quiet faithfulness it took to keep going. For women starting over, the rainbow is a reminder that new beginnings come with grace, that God doesn't rush us into the next chapter without reassurance, and that even after everything changes, his promises remain steady. When we bring Noah's story into our lives today, it becomes clear that starting over rarely looks like a clean slate. Most of the time, it looks like rebuilding with wisdom you didn't have before. It looks like choosing differently because you've lived through enough to know what doesn't work anymore, and that matters. Starting over today can feel vulnerable. It can feel like admitting you didn't get everything right the first time. It can feel like grief for the version of life you thought you'd be living by now. But Noah's story reframes that completely. Starting over with God is not about erasing the past, it's about moving forward with intention. Some of you are rebuilding confidence after a season that shook you. Some of you are redefining purpose after disappointment. Some of you are starting again after burnout, heartbreak, or a version of life that simply didn't align anymore. And Noah's story reminds us that new beginnings with God are never random. They are always rooted in obedience, growth, and preparation. You are not late, you are not behind, and you are not starting from scratch. You are starting from experience, from endurance, from lessons learned the hard way, and that foundation matters more than speed ever could. Before we move into reflection and prayer, I want to pause right here and check in with you. Starting over can be emotionally heavy, even when it's the right thing to do, and sometimes we don't realize how much we're carrying until we slow down long enough to listen to our own thoughts. If this episode is resonating with you, make sure you're following Holy Girl Talk so you don't miss future conversations like this one. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, someone who's rebuilding, restarting, or stepping into a new chapter, share this episode with them. Starting over can feel lonely, and sometimes hearing someone else put words to the process makes all the difference. Also, quick reminder to take care of yourself today. Eat something nourishing, drink some water, and give yourself permission to move at a steady pace. Growth doesn't require burnout, rebuilding doesn't require urgency. God works just as powerfully in consistency as he does in big moments. As we start to close out this episode, I want to invite you into a moment of reflection. Not a moment to criticize yourself or replay everything you wish you'd done differently, but a moment to notice where you are right now. Ask yourself, what am I rebuilding in this season? What has God asked me to start again, even if I didn't plan on starting over? And what does obedience look like for me today? Not in theory, but in practice. You might also ask, where have I been tempted to rush the process because I want relief more than I want growth? Where have I been measuring progress by speed instead of faithfulness? And what would it look like to trust that slow rebuilding is still meaningful rebuilding? Noah's story reminds us that starting over doesn't mean you failed. It often means you survived something and came out changed. And that awareness alone is enough for today. You don't need all the answers, you just need to keep showing up to what God is asking of you right now. God, we come to you today with open hands and honest hearts. We bring the parts of our lives that feel unfinished, uncertain, or in the middle of rebuilding. You see where we've had to start again, where we've had to let go, and where obedience has required more patience than we expected. Give us the strength to keep building what you've asked us to build, even when progress feels slow. Help us trust you in the unseen work, in the quiet consistency, and in the days that don't feel remarkable. Remind us that obedience is never wasted and that you are present in every step, even when we don't feel immediate reassurance. For anyone listening who feels discouraged, isolated, or unsure of what comes next, bring peace and clarity. Help us release comparison, urgency, and pressure and replace them with trust, endurance, and steady faith. We thank you for new beginnings, for fresh starts, and for the grace that meets us when we step forward in obedience. Amen. As we close out today's episode, I want you to hold on to this truth. You are not starting from nothing. You are starting from faithfulness. Every step you've taken, every hard season you've walked through, and every moment you chose obedience over ease has been shaping you for what comes next. If this episode spoke to you, make sure you're following Holy Girl Talk so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have questions, prayer requests, or stories you'd like to share, you can email us at holygirltalkpodcast@gmail.com. I read them and I pray over them. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for listening, reflecting, and choosing to keep going even when rebuilding feels slow. Until next time, Holy Girl, keep trusting God as you rebuild, restart, and step into the new chapter He's leading you toward.